There is a specific kind of silence that has vanished from the world. If you were born in the 1980s, you know exactly what I mean. It was the silence of an afternoon with no notifications, no pings, no glowing rectangle vibrating like a second heartbeat. The air felt wider. Time felt heavier. Not empty, not boring in a tragic way, but heavy with the weight of possibility. The sense that anything could happen because nothing was already happening to you. Look at the world in the year 2026 and it can feel like we crossed a border without noticing. Not just a new decade, but a new dimension. Human connection still exists, of course, but the rules of the language have changed. Many of us learned that language, we speak it every day, we can even sound fluent. And still, it never quite feels like our mother tongue. We remember the world before it was constantly mapped, tracked, rated, and archived. Not because the past was perfect, but because the structure of life forced a certain kind of inner muscle to develop. A muscle that does not get much exercise when every moment is guided, optimized, and shared. Think back to the weight of a key around your neck. Back then, being a latchkey kid was not always seen as a tragedy. In many homes, it was a rite of passage, a small metal symbol of trust. The school bus door hissed open, your shoes hit the pavement, and a 3-hour window appeared. A window of unsupervised sovereignty. There was no GPS in your backpack, no location dot moving on someone else's screen. If you wanted to see a friend, you rode your bike to their house and knocked. If nobody answered, you rode somewhere else. If you got lost, you learned the streets by feel. You learned which corner meant you were close to home. You learned the sound of the neighbourhood, the way it changed as the afternoon shifted. And yes, that freedom came with risks. Not every street was safe. Not every home was stable. Some kids carried too much responsibility too early. Some were lonely. Some got hurt. But for many, the environment trained a skill that is becoming rare. The ability to direct your own life without constant guidance. Because when no one tells you what to do next, you have to invent the next thing. You have to solve your own boredom. You have to negotiate your own conflicts. You have to decide what matters, even if you decide badly and pay for it with a scraped knee or a broken toy you cannot replace. That is how an internal compass forms. Modern psychology would describe parts of this as practice for planning, self-control, flexible thinking, the mental tools often grouped under executive function. The point is not that the 80s were a magical brain training program. The point is simpler. When a child navigates a physical world with fewer safety nets and fewer instant answers, the brain tends to build stronger internal models. You had to remember which yard had the mean dog, which shortcut cut behind the creek, which friend's porch light meant someone was home. You were not just moving through space, you were building a map inside your head. And that kind of mapping leaks into adulthood. It becomes a quiet confidence that problems are solvable. Not because you are smarter than anyone else, but because you grew up practicing the most underrated skill on earth, figuring it out. A bicycle chain slips off. You flip the bike, stain your hands with grease, and you learn the shape of the mechanism. A toy stops working. You shake it, you listen, you open the screws because you want to see what is inside. A friend is mad at you. You cannot hide behind a screen. You have to walk up and face the heat of the moment. Over time, this can produce a certain grit. Not the loud, motivational poster kind, a practical grit. The kind that says, there is probably a solution, and I can probably find it. Now layer in another ingredient the modern world has almost eliminated. Waiting. In 2026, desire is frictionless. If you want a song, it appears. If you want a movie, it streams. If you want an answer, a machine can generate it in seconds. The gap between wanting and having has collapsed. And when that gap collapses, something subtle changes in the way the mind relates to reward. In the 80s, desire was often a long game. Consider the ritual of the radio. You would lie on your bed staring at the ceiling, the room dim, the air warm, a cheap cassette deck beside you. Your fingers hovered over record and play like a trap waiting to snap shut. You wanted one specific song, not a playlist, not an algorithmic mix, one song. So you listened. You listened through static. You listened through the disc jockey talking too long. You listened through songs you did not choose. And when that opening riff finally hit, your heart jumped. You slammed the buttons, you caught it. Not perfectly. Maybe the first second was cut off. Maybe the end had a voice talking over it. But you caught it. And the next detail matters because it is almost extinct now. You rewound the tape with a pencil. You pushed the pencil into the cassette wheel and turned it by hand, feeling the resistance, hearing the soft plastic clicks. That was the physical texture of effort. That was your brain learning again and again that good things can be earned, and that earning them is part of what makes them feel real. The same pattern lived everywhere. You waited a week for the next episode of a show. You waited days for a roll of film to be developed at the local pharmacy, and you did not know if the pictures would be good until you held them in your hands. You waited for a letter to arrive, and the mailbox was not a symbol on a screen. It was a real box with a real hinge and a real sound when it opened. This does not mean the past was morally superior. It means the tempo of life-trained patience by default. When rewards arrive instantly, the mind can start to expect instant feedback everywhere. When rewards arrive slowly, the mind can learn to stay alive inside the waiting. Many people from that era became comfortable in the quiet space between the start of a task and its completion. Comfortable enough to keep going without applause, without likes, without a constant stream of proof that they are doing it right. And that comfort is not nostalgia. It is a capability. It is also one reason the modern world can feel so exhausting. Not because technology is evil, but because constant immediacy can turn every moment into a demand. Answer now, respond now, update now, prove you exist now. Back then you could be unreachable. If you left your house, you were for a while off the grid. Unless you found a payphone and had a pocket full of quarters, nobody could summon you. That created a kind of sacred space. It gave you time that belonged only to you. Time to daydream. Time to cool down. Time to process feelings without performing them. Today, many people are hungry for that space without knowing what it is called, and that hunger is the first clue, because once you name what disappeared, you can start to understand what it gave you. A quieter mind, a stronger internal compass, a relationship with effort that does not collapse when the reward is not immediate, a life that still had rooms where nobody was watching. That is where the story really begins. To understand the 1980s mind, you also have to understand something that has almost vanished: the monoculture. In the year 2026, attention is fractured into 1 billion digital shards. Every person lives inside a personalized feed, guided by invisible systems that learn what you click, what you pause on, what makes you angry, what makes you feel seen. It sounds like freedom, and in some ways it is, but it also means we rarely share the same reality for very long. In the 80s, the world was narrower, and because it was narrower, it was often shared. There were fewer television channels, fewer major radio stations. The newspaper that arrived at your house was the same one your neighbours read. So on a Monday morning, kids on the playground had a common language. A movie everyone had watched, a song everyone had heard, a cartoon everyone could quote. That shared vocabulary did something important. It created social cohesion. Not perfect harmony, not an absence of conflict, but a baseline sense that you were participating in the same story as the people around you. It also forced you to practice a skill that the modern world can accidentally weaken: communicating across differences. When there are only a few cultural touchstones, you cannot live entirely inside your niche. You learn to engage with things you might not have chosen, because they are what your friends are talking about. You learn how to sit through someone else's favourite song. You learn how to watch a show you do not love, because everyone will be discussing it tomorrow. You learn how to coexist inside a shared room. And then there was the social world where the rules were even harsher. The playground. The 1980s playground was a laboratory with very little supervision. That is not a romantic statement. It could be messy. It could be cruel. Some kids got bullied. Some carried wounds that lasted. But for many children, the playground trained real-time human skills in a way that screens cannot replicate. If you had a conflict, you could not block someone. You could not mute their voice. You could not delete their comment and pretend it never happened. You had to face them. You had to negotiate, argue, apologize, retaliate, or find a new group and accept the cost. This did not automatically produce perfect emotional intelligence. Sometimes it produced defensiveness. Sometimes it produced silence. But it did force you to learn social physics. You learned what a look meant. You learned how tone changes when someone is about to explode. You learned the difference between playful teasing and a real warning. You learned how alliances form and dissolve, how jokes can heal or injure, how status works when no adult is managing the outcome. Most of all, you learned that relationships are not clean. They have friction. And if you want to stay connected to people, you have to learn how to tolerate some of that friction without panicking. This is one reason the modern world can feel so emotionally volatile. When your primary conflict tools are block, unfollow, and disappear, you can lose practice in the art of repair. When your primary social arena is text and icons, you can lose some sensitivity to what's happening in a human face. People who grew up in the 80s often carry an older kind of social literacy. Not superior, just different. More trained in physical presence, more trained in reading what is not said. Before the era of the second screen, when you talked to someone, you were usually only talking to them. You were not half listening while your thumb scrolled. You were absorbing micro-expressions, timing, posture, energy. Conversation had weight because attention had fewer exits. That weight of attention built empathy in a specific way, not as a slogan, but as a lived habit. The habit of being fully in the room. And that brings us to the most underestimated force in the 80s childhood: boredom. Today, boredom is an endangered species. The moment a gap appears, we fill it. A line at the store, a quiet moment in the car, a pause before sleep. The hand reaches for the screen as if the mind cannot be trusted to exist without stimulation. But in the 80s, boredom was not a crisis. It was a season. It was the long summer afternoon with nothing scheduled. It was the car ride across the state staring at trees, counting telephone poles, watching clouds move like slow animals. It was the moment you stood in the kitchen, hungry, but not hungry enough to make food, waiting for something to happen. In those empty stretches, the brain often does something extraordinary. It starts to wander. It starts to connect ideas. It starts to create. This is where the default mode network lives, the mental state where imagination, reflection, and self-storytelling take place. You do not have to know the neuroscience to recognize the experience. It is the moment you build an entire movie in your head. It is the moment you suddenly understand something about yourself while staring at nothing. Boredom was the engine of creativity, because there were fewer external engines competing with it. If you wanted entertainment, you built it. A fort from old refrigerator boxes, a neighborhood game with rules invented on the spot, a story for action figures that got more complex every day, a plan to ride bikes to a place you had never been, just to see what was there. This is why people from that era often describe the past with one word that does not appear enough in modern life: adventure. Not the Instagram kind. The kind where you disappear for hours and come back dusty, sunburned, and alive. Now add another ritual that shaped attention in a way most younger people have never felt: the video rental store. A Blockbuster or a local mum and pop shop was not just a place to get a movie. It was a cathedral of anticipation. You walked the aisles staring at box art like it was stained glass. You debated. You negotiated with siblings. You made a decision, and the decision mattered because you were committing. You chose 1 or 2 movies for the weekend. That was it. If the movie was terrible, you watched it anyway, because you had carried it home and you had paid for it, and you had invested effort in the choice. That experience trained something that endless streaming can weaken: the ability to stay with one story long enough to let it work on you. In the modern world, abundance can create a strange paralysis. Too many options, too many tabs open in the mind. The moment something feels slow, you switch. The moment something feels imperfect, you abandon it. But in the 80s, scarcity forced depth. You learned to focus. You learned to tolerate the slow parts. You learned to give your full attention to a narrative and let it build. And attention is not just a productivity tool. Attention is how you build a life. Because the more your attention is scattered, the more your sense of self can become scattered with it. This is where the 80s had a hidden advantage that is easy to misunderstand. We lived lives that were less performative, not because we were morally purer, but because there was less infrastructure for performance. There were no followers, no likes, no metrics that turned identity into a scoreboard. You did not document every meal. You did not broadcast every minor achievement. You did things simply because you wanted to do them. You went on adventures that no one ever saw. You had conversations that were never recorded. You made mistakes that did not become permanent artifacts. That last part is critical. Privacy. We grew up in a world where embarrassment was written in sand, not in digital stone. If you did something ridiculous in middle school, it lived inside a few memories and then faded. You were allowed to evolve. You were allowed to change your mind, your style, your personality, without a searchable archive following you into adulthood. This does not mean the 80s had no anxiety. People struggled then too. It means many fears were less amplified, less quantified, less broadcast. The world did not constantly mirror your worst moments back to you through a feed. That freedom to fail in relative privacy can help a person develop an internal sense of self, a sense that does not depend entirely on audience reaction. A sense built from time alone with your thoughts, from boredom, from long gaps where you could hear yourself. The modern world is now trying to buy back what it accidentally sold. That is why people return to vinyl. That is why digital detoxes have become a thing. That is why being present is treated like a wellness practice, instead of the default state of being human. The hunger is real because the loss is real, and the deeper lesson is not that the past should be resurrected exactly as it was. The lesson is that the skills the 80s trained are not obsolete. They are becoming valuable again. Self-directed living, comfort in the waiting, depth of attention, the ability to be alone without being lonely, the ability to repair instead of escape, the ability to treat technology as a tool instead of a master. If you are from that era, you are not outdated. You are a person who grew up in two worlds, and that dual citizenship carries a kind of wisdom. Not the wisdom of superiority, the wisdom of comparison. You remember what it feels like when life has fewer exits. You remember what it feels like when silence is not something to fear. And if you can remember it clearly, you can teach it not as nostalgia, but as a blueprint. Because the future is moving faster than anyone can truly track. And in a world like that, the most valuable people may be the ones who still know how to slow down on purpose. That ability to slow down on purpose is not just a personality trait, it is a form of power. Because the modern world does not only distract you, it trains you. Every time you reach for the screen the instant a gap appears, you're practicing a specific habit of mind. You're practicing escape. You're practicing constant input. You're practicing the belief that silence is dangerous, that boredom is a problem, that being unreachable is irresponsible. And over time, those practices build a nervous system that expects the world to be loud. This is why so many people feel exhausted even when they have not done anything physically difficult. Their attention has been sprinting all day. Their mind has been switching lanes every few seconds. Their identity has been pulled into performance, into reaction, into a constant negotiation with the invisible crowd. The 80s did not give us better souls. It gave many of us a different baseline. A life with fewer interruptions meant we spent more time inside our own thoughts, and that trained a quiet kind of self-trust. So the question is not whether the past was better. The question is what we can bring forward. Because the skills are transferable. You can rebuild the internal compass in a digital world. You can rebuild patience. You can rebuild deep attention. You can rebuild privacy. You can rebuild presence. The tools that damage those qualities can also be used to protect them, but only if you decide what your life is for. Start with something simple and almost absurd in its simplicity. Create unreachable time, not forever, not as a dramatic escape, just a small window that belongs to no one else. 1 hour, put the phone in another room, not face down on the table, not in your pocket. Another room, close the door. Let your body feel the first wave of discomfort. The phantom vibration that is not real, the itch to check, the fear that you might be missing something important. The discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It is the sound of withdrawal from constant stimulation. It is the mind realizing that it does not control you as much as it thought. Then do nothing for 5 minutes. Just sit, look out a window, listen to the hum of your home. Let boredom appear. Because boredom is not the enemy. Boredom is the doorway. If you stay inside it long enough, something starts to happen. Your mind begins to wander. It brings up unfinished thoughts. It begins to connect loose wires. It starts to create. This is why so many of your best ideas arrive in the shower, on a walk, or in the last seconds before sleep. Those are the rare moments when the machine is not feeding you. Those are the rare moments when you can hear yourself. You can expand that doorway with another lost ritual. Walk without a destination, not as exercise, not as content, no headphones, no podcast, no soundtrack, just walk. At first it will feel empty, like you're wasting time. That feeling is the modern world speaking through you. It has taught you that every moment must be productive, monetized, optimized, or documented. But after 10 minutes, the environment starts to return. You notice small details, the temperature, the smell of the air, the way people move when they think no one is watching, the sound of leaves, the rhythm of your own steps. That is reality reasserting itself, and reality is where you recover your agency. Because agency is not an abstract concept. It is the lived experience of choosing what you pay attention to. Now bring back the sacred weight. Pick one thing you want and refuse the instant version of it for a while. If you want a song, do not stream it immediately. Put it on a list. Wait until you are home and can listen properly. Sit down. Play it once without doing anything else. Let it land. If you want an answer, do not ask a machine right away. Sit with the question for a day. Write what you think first. See what your mind produces before you outsource it. This is not anti-technology. This is pro-human. When you remove the instant solution, you force your brain to engage. You force it to build the mental model instead of renting one. That is how competence forms. And competence is one of the most reliable sources of calm. Not the calm of denial, the calm of capability. Another practice is even more uncomfortable, and that is why it matters. Stop performing your life for a while. Do something beautiful that no one sees. Cook a meal and do not photograph it. Go somewhere and do not post it. Accomplish something small and do not tell anyone. Keep it private. At first, this can feel strange, almost like the experience is incomplete without an audience. That feeling is not your personality. It is conditioning. You have been trained to convert life into proof. But private joy does something profound. It returns experience to its original owner. It teaches the mind that meaning is not granted by reaction. Meaning can be generated internally. That is the core of a stable self, and it connects to the most politically underestimated concept of all. Privacy. Privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is space. It is the space where you can fail without being branded. The space where you can change your mind without being mocked by a record of your past. The space where you can grow without being trapped in the version of yourself that got the most engagement. In the 80s, privacy was built into the structure of life. Today, it has to be built intentionally. That is not a tragedy. It is simply the new reality. You decide where you are trackable. You decide when you are reachable. You decide what parts of your identity are not for sale. You decide what stays unrecorded. And that decision is not a small lifestyle choice. It is a statement of ownership. Because the deeper truth is this: the modern world is not just competing for your time, it is competing for your mind, and whoever controls your mind controls your life. This is where the 80s perspective can be a gift, not because we are better, but because we remember the contrast. We remember what it feels like when attention is not constantly harvested. We remember what it feels like to be fully present without calling it a practice. We are one of the few groups alive with a clear memory of both worlds, the heavy analog past and the lightning digital present. That makes us translators. Not judges, translators. We can show younger people that being unreachable is not immoral. It is healthy. We can show them that boredom is not a defect. It is creative fuel. We can show them that waiting is not suffering. It is a skill. We can show them that presence is not a luxury. It is the foundation of intimacy. And we can also learn from them, because the new world has its own strengths: access, opportunity, community across distance. Voices that were once isolated now finding each other. The goal is not to go backward. The goal is to carry forward what keeps the human spirit intact. So if you were raised in the 80s, do not treat your memories like museum pieces. Treat them like equipment. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the keys in your pocket, the streetlights coming on, the feeling of being off the grid, the long wait for the song, the fort made of cardboard, the bike ride with no destination, the unrecorded conversation that changed your life. Those were not just moments, they were training. And in a world that is getting louder, faster and more demanding, that training may be exactly what the future needs most. Tonight, take one small step back toward that older rhythm. Create 1 hour of silence. Let boredom arrive. Let your mind wander. Let your life be unobserved for a while. You will not lose anything real by doing this. But you might regain something you forgot you had. A deeper attention, a stronger compass, a quieter courage, and the unmistakable feeling that your life belongs to you again.